Hey there, welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be like getting down to the nitty-gritty of everyday English.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, like those essential phrases that help you feel more confident and, just flow better in conversations.
Right. Yeah. Like having those key phrases right there at your fingertips.
Exactly. So you can just, navigate any social situation without missing a beat.
For sure.
And for this deep dive, we've got a really great resource. It's this podcast that breaks down English phrases for like both beginner and intermediate learners.
Nice.
Yeah. And what really stood out to me was just how practical the phrases are. We're talking greetings, apologies, asking for help, like all the stuff you use every single day.
It's really fascinating how these like simple phrases can be so powerful. They're not just about conveying information.
Right.
It's about like building connections and like establishing rapport with people.
It's so true.
Yeah.
And this source, it doesn't just tell you what to say, but it really digs into the why. Like it gives you these insights into how these phrases actually work in different social contexts.
That's so key because language isn't just about words. It's about understanding all the nuances and, those unspoken rules that kind of shape how we interact with each other.
For sure. Okay, so let's jump right in. The podcast kicks off with greetings and first impressions.
Okay.
And I have to say, it really made me rethink even like the most basic phrases. Like, how are you? For instance.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so commonplace.
Yeah.
But have you ever really thought about how much it reveals about our cultural norms?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, in a lot of English-speaking cultures, how are you isn't really a request for a detailed health report.
Right.
It's more of a way to like acknowledge someone
Yeah.
and, signal that you're open to having a conversation.
That makes so much sense.
But,
And it explains why we often just say like, I'm good, thanks, even if our day is a total disaster.
exactly. It's about keeping that social flow going rather than like dumping all your problems on someone.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like finding that balance between politeness and privacy.
Totally.
And the source points out that you don't always have to stick with the standard, how are you? You can use all kinds of variations to like spice things up.
Like what?
How's it going? How have you been?
Yeah.
Just find what feels natural and comfortable for you.
I love that. It's all about finding your own voice within the framework of polite conversation.
Right. It's like you're given a set of tools, but then you get to build your own communication style.
Exactly.
And it reminds me of something I used to struggle with when I was learning English. Like, how do you respond when you're the one being asked, how are you?
Yeah. It can be a bit tricky figuring out how much detail to give.
Totally.
Well, the source actually gives some great examples, ranging from the casual, I'm good, to the more formal, I'm doing well, thank you.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is it highlights how important it is to return the question.
Oh, you mean like asking, how about you, after you respond?
Exactly. It shows that you're not just going through the motions, you're actually interested in the other person.
Such a small thing, but it makes a huge difference. It really turns a simple exchange into a genuine connection.
For sure.
Now, what about when you're meeting someone for the very first time? The podcast talks a lot about the importance of saying nice to meet you.
Right.
But is that really enough to make a lasting impression?
Well, nice to meet you is definitely a good starting point. But the source takes it a step further. It talks about adding little things like, it's really nice to meet you, or I'm so pleased to meet you.
Gotcha.
And it's amazing how those little changes can add more warmth and personality to your greeting.
It's like you're taking that standard phrase and making it your own.
Precisely. And the source also reminds us that words are only part of the equation. Our body language can say just as much.
Oh, absolutely.
A genuine smile, a firm handshake. All those nonverbal cues can make all the difference in creating a good first impression.
It's like you're sending this message that says, I'm happy to be here, and I'm actually interested in talking to you.
Exactly. It's about showing that you're open and engaged.
Okay, now what about when you're greeting someone you've met before? Like this, nice to see you again. Really cut it.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It can sound a bit repetitive, especially if you see that person often.
Exactly.
Well, the podcast actually addresses that and gives some alternative phrases like, it's great to see you again, or it's so good to see you again. These small changes can make your greeting sound less robotic and more genuine.
I like it. It's like you're acknowledging that you have a history with this person.
Right.
Making the interaction more personal.
Absolutely. And the source also highlights how important it is to remember people's names.
Yeah.
It seems like such a small thing. But using someone's name shows that you've made an effort to remember them.
It's true.
They're not just a random face in the crowd.
I'm always so impressed by people who can remember names. It makes you feel seen and valued. Okay, so we've covered greetings both for new encounters and familiar faces. But what about expressing gratitude?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's another one of those cornerstones of everyday conversation, but I think we often take it for granted.
You're so right. A simple thank you can go a long way in showing appreciation and building rapport.
Yeah, but just like with greetings, there's an art to using it effectively.
Absolutely.
And the source really dives into that. It explores all these different ways to say thank you, depending on the situation and the level of formality.
Right. So you have the casual thanks or thanks a lot.
Uh-huh.
And for more formal situations, thank you very much. Always works well.
Yeah.
And then you have those phrases that express even deeper gratitude, like, I really appreciate it, or I'm so grateful for your help.
Yeah, it's about finding the words that truly match how you feel.
Exactly.
And it's just as important to know how to respond when someone thanks you.
Right.
The podcast reminds us that a simple "you're welcome" or "no problem" can work just fine in casual settings. But for those times when you want to show a deeper level of reciprocity,
I see.
you might say something like, "It was my pleasure," or "I'm happy to help."
Right. It's about matching your response to the context of the conversation.
Exactly. Okay, now let's talk about a phrase that's all about being gracious and considerate. Excuse me.
Oh, yeah.
I've always thought of it as the ultimate social lubricant. You know, it smooths over so many potentially awkward interactions.
It's so true. The podcast actually calls it the Swiss Army knife of English phrases.
I love that.
It can be used for so many things, like getting someone's attention, apologizing for interrupting, or even navigating a crowded room.
It's amazing how one little phrase can do so much.
Right?
Like, imagine you need to ask someone a question. If you start with, "Excuse me," it makes the request sound so much softer.
It really does. Like, instead of just blurting out, what time is it?
Right.
You can say, excuse me, could you tell me the time? That's a small tweak that makes a big difference.
And it's the same idea when you need to get past someone in a crowded place. Saying "excuse me" as you squeeze by just acknowledges their presence.
He does.
Make the interaction less intrusive.
The podcast also makes a really good point about how your tone of voice and body language play a huge role in how, is received.
Oh, for sure.
Like a friendly tone and a smile can turn a potentially annoying situation into a moment of shared courtesy.
It's about sending the message that you respect their space and you're trying to be considerate.
Totally. And of course, excuse me is also what you say when you accidentally bump into someone or make a little social blunder.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's a quick and easy way to acknowledge the mistake and smooth things over.
It's like an instant apology button,
I like that.
signaling that you didn't mean any harm and you know how to behave in social situations.
Right. So, excuse me is great for those little social hiccups. But what about when you need to apologize for something more serious? That's where "I'm sorry" comes in.
Right. And the podcast really stresses how important it is to be sincere when you say "I'm sorry."
Yeah.
It's not just about saying the words. It's about actually feeling remorse and taking responsibility for what you did.
Absolutely. People can tell when you're not being genuine.
They can.
A true apology involves recognizing how your actions impacted the other person and showing that you understand how they feel.
Right. The source also says that it can be helpful to explain why you're apologizing.
Oh, okay.
So instead of just saying "I'm sorry,"
As serious.
you could say "I'm sorry for being late. I got stuck in traffic."
That makes sense. Adding that context shows that you understand why you're apologizing
Exactly.
and that you're not just trying to brush it off.
Yeah. And sometimes it's appropriate to go even further and offer a solution
Okay.
or ask how you can fix things. Like, "I'm sorry I spilled coffee on your shirt. Can I pay for the dry cleaning?"
Right. Shows that you're willing to go beyond words and actually take action to make things right.
Exactly. So we've talked about how to apologize. But what about when you're the one receiving the apology? How should you respond?
Well, the podcast says that a simple "that's okay" or "no problem" is usually enough to acknowledge the apology. It shows that you're ready to move on.
Right. But sometimes a more thoughtful response might be better,
Yeah,
especially if the offense was serious or the relationship is important to you.
I see.
In those cases, you might say, "I appreciate the apology," or "Thank you for saying that."
Okay.
Those phrases can help to restore harmony and rebuild trust.
It's all about choosing a response that feels right for you and fits the situation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've covered greetings, apologies, and that all important. Excuse me.
Right.
But what about those times when you just need to ask for help?
Oh, yeah. That can be a tough one, especially for people learning a new language.
Absolutely. It can feel really vulnerable admitting that you need assistance.
It can.
But the podcast reframes this in a really beautiful way. It says that asking for help is actually a sign of strength, not weakness.
Wow. I like that.
Yeah. It's about acknowledging that we don't have all the answers and that it's okay to rely on others for support.
That's a good way to think about it.
Right. And when you really think about it, asking for help is often the fastest way to learn and grow.
That's true. You're tapping into other people's knowledge and experience.
Exactly. It's like a shortcut to success.
I like it.
So how do you ask for help in a way that's clear and polite without sounding like you're imposing?
Well, the podcast breaks it down, starting with the classic, "Can you help me?"
Okay.
It's straightforward and to the point, but there are ways to soften it and make it sound more polite.
Oh, like what?
Instead of just, "Can you help me?"
Mm-hmm.
You could say something like, "Could you give me a hand with this?" Or, "Do you have a moment to help me with something?"
Those are great. They sound so much more considerate.
They do, right. It's like you acknowledging that you're asking for their time and effort.
Exactly. The podcast also points out how important it is to be specific about what kind of help you need.
Oh, yeah. That makes sense.
So instead of, "Can you help me?"
Mm-hmm.
You could say, "Can you help me find the nearest bus stop?"
Yeah.
Or, "Can you help me figure out how to use this coffee machine?"
Right. Being specific makes it so much easier for the other person to help you.
For sure. And of course, once someone helps you, don't forget to say thank you.
Of course.
Just a small gesture that goes a long way in showing your appreciation.
It does.
Okay, so we talked about asking for help in general, but what about those moments when you need help understanding something someone said?
Uh,
Like maybe you missed a word or two, or the topic is just a bit over your head.
I've been there.
It can be so awkward to admit that you didn't understand something,
It can.
especially if you don't want to seem rude or inattentive.
Right?
But the podcast gives a brilliant solution. Could you repeat that, please?
It's so simple, yet so effective.
Right. It politely signals that you need clarification without bringing the conversation to a halt.
And the best part is it can be adapted to different situations.
Oh, like how?
Like if it's noisy, you can add, "Could you speak a little louder, please?"
Right.
Or if they're talking super fast, you can ask, "Could you speak a little more slowly, please?"
I like it. It's all about adjusting your request to the specific circumstances.
Exactly. And the podcast makes a really good point that most people are totally happy to repeat themselves. If you ask politely,
I think that's true.
it shows that you're both working together to make sure the message is clear.
Communication is a two-way street.
It is.
So we've covered. Could you repeat that, please? But what if you still don't understand even after the person repeats themselves?
Yeah, that can be tricky.
It can be so tempting to just pretend you get it, to avoid embarrassment.
I know.
But the podcast really emphasizes the importance of being honest and saying, "I don't understand."
It's true.
I think we've all been in those situations where we nod along like we're following the conversation, but really we're totally lost.
Yeah, I've done that.
But in the long run, it's so much better to just admit when you're confused.
Absolutely. That's the only way you can really learn and move forward.
And it also shows that you're really listening and trying to understand.
Right. You're not just passively taking it in.
Exactly. Now, the podcast does give some alternative ways to express that you don't understand.
Oh, okay.
Ways that might feel a little softer or less direct.
Like what?
Instead of, "I don't understand," you could say, "I'm not sure I follow," or "I don't quite get it."
Okay, those sound a bit less intimidating.
Right. And if you need even more clarification, you can always follow up with a specific question. Like, "Could you explain that again?" Or, "Can you give me an example?"
Those are good ones. They show that you're actively trying to understand the concept.
Exactly. Now, what about when you're the one explaining something and the other person says they don't understand?
That's a good question.
It can be a little frustrating sometimes.
It can be, but the podcast reminds us that everyone learns at their own pace.
It's true.
And that sometimes you need to get a little creative to find the right explanation that clicks for someone.
Like maybe they need a different example, a visual aid, or just a simpler explanation.
Yeah, it's about being flexible and adjusting your communication style to fit their needs.
It's all about meeting them where they are and guiding them toward understanding.
Totally.
Okay, we covered a lot of ground here, but there's one more phrase I want to touch on before we move on.
Okay.
It's essential for those moments when nature calls, especially when you're in a new place.
Oh, you mean where's the restroom?
Exactly. The podcast points out that this is a question everyone should know, especially when traveling or exploring new places.
It also brings up an interesting point about regional differences